Hey guys, it's the Loud Guys. Today we are going to watch why Putin is scared of Finland's new NATO membership and like how Finland's NATO membership checkmates Russia. So like this is something like we have seen like okay, if Finland joins, what will happen? Now we all know that Finland has already joined NATO membership, and the thing is like this is a very big thing because now you can see like most of the European countries are now part of the NATO, so that is a very big thing. And like so you cannot touch even any one of those, and like Putin always had that feeling. You can always get that feeling if you see all those videos where it is shown that he always wanted to get that Soviet Union back. He never wanted the Soviet Union to collapse because when you see Soviet Union on the map, it was so big, all the other countries were inside it, but then it collapsed and so many countries were detached of it, and Putin just hated that concept. So he wanted all the countries back, but most of the countries are now part of the NATO, but there are still some countries like Ukraine and all these countries. But I think if Ukraine gets one moment, then it will just go back and try to join the NATO membership as soon as possible, because if it was a part of NATO at this moment, then there would have been no war at all in Ukraine. So we'll see what happens.
So now if I talk about India, I feel India is like it's actually not a part of NATO, and it has good relations with Russia and USA. So I think USA is very strong, and that is the same case with Russia also, because Russia has completely destroyed Ukraine, and it has a lot of powers actually. That's why they had the guts of doing that. So I remember when the war started between Ukraine and Russia, there was nothing done by India. We Indians were thinking what is going to be next. Does Modi ji does anything about it? Does he take anyone's side? Does he join NATO? Does he ask Ukraine to join NATO? But nothing happened. He was all quiet. So let's see. I mean, I really want to know how Finland's journey begins, because now it's a part of NATO. So like, is Russian is Putin scared of it, or is Putin really is it bothering Putin that Finland is a part of NATO? So let's see what happens.
Because the thing was, India is like profiteering from everything. Like what India is doing is buying Russian oil on cheap and then selling it back to Europe. So that is what India is doing, because Europe is not buying that oil directly from Russia, but they want Russian oil. So what India is doing, India is just taking that and like exporting that again. So that is what India is doing. But the thing is like India has had a very good relationship with Russia in the past also, because like in previous wars when America was helping Pakistan, so Russia was on the side of India. So India can just not leave Russia like that. But yes, what Russia is doing at this moment is very, very wrong, and war is not a good thing for the whole world. So we will see like how scared he is about the NATO membership, and like how close he is to like losing this war. So let's see this.
A small contingent of Russian soldiers patrols the border. Their numbers are small, as many of their comrades have been sent south to fight a losing war against Ukraine. The soldiers are ordered to cross the border in a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Hesitantly, they proceed, but as soon as they traverse the line between the two nations, they're met by M1 Abrams and Leopard 2 tanks. F-35 Lightning IIs scream through the air, and heavily armed NATO soldiers appear from seemingly nowhere. This hypothetical scenario is what's in store for Russian forces if they even think about attacking Finland. Russia had no hope of successfully invading Finland to begin with, and now the country is a part of NATO. The moment Russia shows any sign of aggression against Finland, 30 other countries will come to their aid, including the United States. This would be checkmate for Vladimir Putin. When Russia invaded Ukraine, 80% of the Finnish population wanted to join NATO. Previously, this was a country where the vast majority of people staunchly wanted to remain neutral. However, the very real threat of a Russian invasion
when you see
is
a
enough
neighbor
to change
getting
the
hurt,
mind
you're
of
like,
even the most staunch supporters
let's get
of
the
neutrality.
security.
The history between Russia and Finland has not been pleasant. And even though the Nordic nation has been improving its military over the years and is more than capable of defending itself, the population felt they needed to make a strong statement against their aggressive neighbor. So on May 17, 2022, Finland, along with Sweden, applied to be a part of NATO. Other Western powers applauded this move. It would allow NATO to be much more powerful and open up a whole new gateway to keep Russia in check. Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, was furious. He threatened to launch missiles, invade, or take drastic actions to keep Finland from being accepted.
He does
into
not
the
talk
alliance.
normally, no?
For a while, the
Launch
world held
missiles.
its breath to see what Putin would do, since their application would be forfeit if he declared war against Finland before they were voted into NATO. The bylaws of the organization state that any nation which is already at war cannot be accepted. However, at this time, Putin had a much bigger problem developing in Ukraine. His forces were being decimated by Western weapons and the superior tactical skills of the Ukrainian military. Russia was taking heavy losses and being pushed further and further back toward its own borders. Putin didn't have the men or resources to launch an invasion of Finland, and even if he did, it's likely the Finnish military would crush anything Russia could throw at it.
Yeah.
For almost a year, Finland's acceptance into NATO was hampered by two nations, Turkey and Hungary.
Oh, why?
In order for a new nation to be admitted into the organization, all previous members need to vote for their acceptance. These two nations were the only thing standing in the way of Finland joining the most powerful military organization in the world.
But why?
Obviously, Vladimir Putin hoped they would never be admitted and that he could find a way to keep his northernmost neighbor from becoming even closer to the United States and its allies. The key thing to remember is that one of Putin's biggest reasons for invading Ukraine was to keep Western powers from encroaching further toward Russian borders. The Russian dictator claimed the war in Ukraine is carried out in self-defense as NATO nations and their forces threatened Russia's security. And to be fair, Putin wasn't wrong. However, even as NATO was becoming stronger, Finland had no plans to change its neutral stance. Unfortunately for Putin, his invasion of Ukraine drove the Finnish government right into the arms of NATO. He single-handedly caused a national shift in thinking, resulting in Finland dropping its neutral stance and searching for allies. Something that up to that point no one else had been able to do. The irony is, Vladimir Putin caused his worst fears to become a reality.
Because of his own
why
actions.
Putin is so afraid of Finland joining NATO and what it might mean for the future of the region.
waking up
On
in the middle
Tuesday,
of the
April
night.
4th, 2023, Finland officially became the 31st nation to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
31
Minister of
nations.
Foreign Affairs Pekka Haavisto, along with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, were all part of the ceremony to officially welcome Finland to the organization. As the officials of those Western nations smiled and shook hands, Vladimir Putin frowned and brooded. When the Finnish
Cried
flag
alone.
was raised alongside the other 30 members of NATO, it stood as a declaration by the Western world that Putin's war in Ukraine and the objectives he hoped to achieve had failed. He could no longer intimidate nations to distance themselves from NATO. He could no longer threaten acts of war to get what he wanted. He could no longer put Finland in a position where it had to fear a repeat of past atrocities against its people. These are all major concerns for Vladimir Putin, but what he really is afraid of is that no one fears him anymore. In fact, Putin's decisions are starting to become a model for exactly what not to do if you rule a country and want to expand its borders. Putin claimed that the invasion of Ukraine was done for two main reasons. The first was that Ukraine itself belonged to Russia, and the people who lived there identified as Russian. This obviously
thinking
isn't
is bad.
true, as the world recognizes Ukraine as a sovereign nation, and the fact that the Ukrainian citizens have been fighting to free their country from Russian forces for over a year proves that they don't want to be a part of Putin's delusion. The second reason why Putin claims he invaded Ukraine is what we mentioned before. The Russian dictators argued NATO is expanding too close to Russia, and therefore posing a security risk to the nation. Therefore, to stop the encroachment of NATO, Russia
NATO's,
had
like,
to
whole
invade
idea
Ukraine
is
to
to
protect
defend.
itself.
Exactly.
This is
Not to
clearly the
attack.
ravings of a lunatic, but to be fair, Ukraine was becoming increasingly westernized and looking to cultivate closer relationships with Europe and other Western nations. But regardless of what Ukraine's geopolitical stance was, Putin had no right to invade the country. This is what made Finland nervous in the first place. Vladimir Putin had continuously talked about forming a new Russian empire, and since Finland was once part of an old Russian empire, the Kremlin's actions were a real cause for concern. In the early stages of the war in Ukraine, when Russia looked like it might be able to secure Kyiv and annex at least part of its territory, Finland went on high alert. If Putin was successful in Ukraine, he would likely try to invade Finland too.
Sure.
So for now, we know that Putin is scared that Finland's NATO membership will bring the military alliance closer to Russian borders. One of Putin's main goals for invading Ukraine was to ensure that NATO access to Russian borders was restricted to the 754 miles or 1,213 kilometers between Norway, Eastern Latvia, Estonia, Poland, and Lithuania. With Finland's admittance to the organization, its 830-mile or 1,335-kilometer border with Russia has more than doubled the border length that NATO countries now share with Russia. And this is the single largest blow to Putin, besides how much of a failure his invasion in Ukraine has been. And as we'll explain in a bit, the extension of NATO's border with Russia via Finland could cripple the nation, as some key strategic and economic hubs are now under direct threat. This, along with several other assets that Finland brings to the table, could spell the end to any type of Russian dominance in the region. NATO is no longer afraid of Putin, and now that Finland is officially part of the organization, it might be only a matter of time before Vladimir Putin loses complete control of his country. Before we examine each
And
aspect of
for
Finland's
me also
acceptance
Finland
into
looks
NATO
more
and how it's
European
bad
than
news for
Russian.
Russia, let's go back in time. Finland has never gotten along with Russia, which happens when a brutal foreign power takes over your country. How did Finland get to where it is today, and how has Russia left such a lasting scar on the nation that it was willing to give up its neutrality in exchange for extra protection? Well, like every part of the world, the history of Finland is long and complicated. In the 1100s, the Finnish people were subjugated during the Swedish Crusades and converted to Christianity. For the next 700 years, there were wars and different rulers in the region. But in 1808, Russia invaded Sweden with the support of Napoleon. And as a result, Finland was ceded to Russia, but surprisingly got to retain its own legal system and religion, while its citizens didn't have to serve in the Russian military. Then in 1899, relations between Russia and Finland started to go south. Tsar Nicholas II pursued policies to force the Russification of Finland. Basically, he wanted to wipe out the Finnish culture and force everyone to embrace
That
the
is the
Russian
start
way of
of
life.
ending, no?
This evidently
When
didn't
you
go
try to
over that
force
well,
your
and the Finns
opinions
started
on
to
other-
protest and fight back against the policies. In 1917, the Russian Revolution started to fracture the empire. Finland took this opportunity to declare their independence. However, they would only be free from the oppressive Russian rule for a few decades before the Red Army came knocking at their door once again. When World War II erupted in Europe, Finland declared that it would remain neutral. Even still, the Soviet Union took advantage of the chaos and invaded Finland in 1939, starting the Winter War. The Finnish army put up stiff resistance, however they were overwhelmed by the Red Army and were forced to sign the Treaty of Moscow, giving the Soviet Union control of about 10% of Finland's territory. With the help of the Nazis, Finland launched an offensive against the Soviet Union to reclaim its territory, but when Germany started to lose the war, Soviet forces came back with a vengeance and forced Finland to give up more land and pay war reparations. Once again, during the Cold War, Finland claimed it would remain neutral and no nuclear
their
missiles or
creativity.
forces from either the Soviets or the US would be allowed within the borders. However, in the 1950s, Finland started to become closer to Western nations, even though the Soviet Union warned against such actions. By 1995, Finland became a member of the European Union, solidifying its connection to Western powers. The first steps toward Finland breaking away from neutrality began in 2016 when its government signed a defense collaboration agreement with the United States. This was a direct result of Russia increasing military activities in the Baltic Sea and annexing Crimea. It was at this time that Finland really started to become concerned with Vladimir Putin's actions and warned other
everything
Western
Finland is
powers of
doing
the
is
very
because
real
of
threat that
Russia's
Russia
actions
posed. This brings us to
They are
the
just
present
protecting
day,
themselves.
where Russia has invaded Ukraine and Finland has joined NATO. It's been clear throughout history that Russia has either fully incorporated Finland into its borders or at least seen them as a country whose land they can steal. So it's no surprise that when Putin started to become even more aggressive in 2022, Finland decided to break its neutrality pact and join NATO.
Finally.
But why does Finland joining NATO change things? And why is it such a bad thing for Putin? Now that Finland is part of the organization, it means that if Putin or any other power tries to attack them, the entire might of the US and every other military in NATO will come to their aid. This is because of Article 5 in the NATO agreement. Finland no longer needs to worry about amassing enough troops or building enough weapons
This is
to
such a
combat
good
Russia
protection,
alone.
huh?
Yes, Finland's military is
Unity
still
has
powerful
power.
and likely
Yes,
could
very
hold its
much
own
power.
against a Russian invasion. But now they don't need to dump tons of money into their military in fear that they might have to fight off an invasion force one day. Also, now that Finland is part of NATO, their forces will become fully integrated into the organization's training and planning programs. This will allow for better cooperation between Finnish soldiers and other NATO militaries. The superior training and cooperation only strengthens the Finnish military while allowing them to work in alignment with other military forces. But we must remember that Finland was already participating in NATO exercises as a partner state. It was actually a prerequisite for joining the organization that Finland needed to ensure their military could integrate current NATO technology and practices. So for years, Finland had been aligning its military to NATO standards.
They always had that plan in
purchased
their mind.
US
Right.
FA-18 fighter jets, German-designed Leopard tanks, and K-9 howitzers used by Norway and Estonia. Therefore, when Finland needed to join NATO for extra protection from Russia, they were good to go.
Good to
The
go.
crazy part is that Putin watched this all happen. He must have known that Finland would jump the neutrality ship and join NATO if he became aggressive, and that's exactly what happened. There is the possibility that Putin thought everyone, including Finland, was too scared to risk upsetting him, but after major defeats in Ukraine and Russia's inability to effectively fight the war, it became apparent that Russia wasn't nearly as powerful as Putin portrayed it to be. However, before it became clear just how disjointed and ineffective the Russian military was, Finland applied to join NATO. This was almost an inevitability even if Russia hadn't invaded Ukraine, as Putin's expansionist rhetoric brought back cultural memories of Finland being subjugated by Russian regimes in the past.
But still,
when
it
Finland
would have not
officially announced it
forced
would
Finland
drop
to
its
do it.
neutral policies in favor of NATO protection, it was very bad news for Putin. And Finland joining NATO isn't just a one-way street. The country has a lot to offer to the alliance. For example, it's generally agreed that Finland's artillery forces are not only the largest, but best equipped in all of Europe.
Oh.
This is out of necessity because of their large border with a belligerent neighbor. In fact, Finland has somewhere around 1,500 artillery weapons made up of 700 howitzer guns, 700 heavy mortars, and 100 rocket launcher systems. This means that the Finnish army has more artillery than Poland, Germany, Norway,
Even
and Sweden
Germany?
combined. This also means that the new stretch of Russian-NATO border is already well defended, which was definitely a plus when Finland was brought on board, as it meant
Right.
other nations didn't need to immediately send artillery and defensive equipment to Finland. Plus, Finland's large artillery force could be incredibly beneficial in fortifying the borders of other countries in the future. Finland also brings strong cybersecurity tech to the table. The tech giant Nokia is based in Finland and is a major provider of 5G infrastructure worldwide.
Oh.
This means Finland is on the cutting edge of communication infrastructure and has the
Well,
ability
Nokia
to
also
improve NATO's
builds
cybersecurity.
telecommunications.
It's not clear exactly how Finland's advanced
Like we knew
cybersecurity will be
phones.
integrated
Exactly.
into NATO practices, but one thing is for sure, in the future, cyber warfare will undoubtedly play a pivotal role in the way militaries wage battle.
Yeah.
Then there's the obvious benefit of the soldiers that Finland provides to the NATO alliance. Since military service is mandatory in Finland, it means that the nation currently has 280,000 troops ready to go at this very moment. However, if Finland ever needed to mobilize its reserves, it would have around 900,000 trained men and women
900,000.
ready to take up arms in a conflict against a potential enemy. We mentioned before that there were two holdouts when it came to ratifying Finland into the NATO alliance. It's worth looking briefly at why this was the case and why Vladimir Putin was hoping that these issues would not be resolved quickly. It was clear to the Russian dictator that if Finland joined NATO, he would have an unstoppable enemy force at his doorstep. This is one of the reasons why Finland's acceptance into NATO terrified him. However, if Turkey and Hungary refused to vote Finland into NATO, Putin would have slightly less to worry about. When Finland and Sweden announced their applications to join NATO, a large majority of the nations in the organization immediately voted them in. This was because of the strategic significance both countries, but particularly Finland, held in the region. However, Turkey refused to ratify the two countries until some concessions were made. Turkey had more of a problem with Sweden, but Finland seemed to be guilty by association. A lot of the contention had to do with how the Kurdish people were being treated and the refusal of Nordic countries to sell Turkey weapons. The Turkish government said it would only vote to accept Sweden and Finland into the organization if they extradited several Kurdistan Workers' Party or PKK terrorist members back to Turkey and publicly disavowed the PKK itself. Obviously, they also wanted both countries to remove their weapon bans as well. Both Sweden and Finland agreed to extradite the terrorists that they were holding. Finland also lifted its arms embargo on Turkey to improve the relations between
they
the two
did
nations.
that.
On March
Yeah.
30th, 2023, Turkey approved
See?
Finland's
So
petition to
innocent.
join
So
NATO.
they were so
Hungary's
desperate.
objection to the
Like, they
admittance of
agreed to
Finland was more
everything.
just about politics than anything else. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán stated that both Sweden and Finland had been spreading slanderous lies about the state of Hungarian democracy. Basically, until they publicly apologized and met with Hungarian leaders,
And
Hungary
even they did
refused to
that?
vote for their acceptance into NATO. Orbán stated, "It's not right for Sweden and Finland to ask us to take them on board while they're spreading blatant lies about Hungary, about the rule of law in Hungary, about democracy, about life here." However, after diplomatic talks, Hungary agreed to move forward with their vote to
Wow.
accept Finland into NATO on March 27th, 2023. After Hungary and Turkey voted for Finland to join the organization, Putin was in big trouble. All of his worst nightmares were coming true. It was now only a matter of time before Finland was officially a part of NATO, and there was nothing he could do about it. Even if he wanted to launch a last-ditch effort to stop the acceptance of Finland into the organization through warfare, he just didn't have the men or resources to do so, as most of Russia's military is still desperately trying to hold little territory it could control in Ukraine. The acceptance of Finland into NATO also set a precedent for other countries that might have tried to remain neutral. Putin's aggressive actions meant that foreign policy norms and international sanctions
I think
would
so all
not
of
always
Europe
work
will
to
be a part
deter
of
an
NATO
aggressor.
somewhere or
Now
other.
that Finland has become a part of NATO, Putin likely fears other nations might also try to join the alliance. There's very little chance that even Putin would be crazy enough to invade a NATO country, as the
Never.
repercussions would be devastating. Russia and all of its
Russia will be
allies
all-
would not be able to
exactly.
defeat NATO forces unless they used nuclear weapons, which would pretty much in the
And
world,
the
and
world.
there's perhaps only one other dictator who's willing to go that far. We're talking about
of
you,
course.
Kim
Kim
Jong-un.
Jong-un.
So now Putin is afraid of NATO forces being close enough to attack major Russian cities from Finland, and that other nations might also seek an alliance with his biggest enemy. There's also the fact that there will be an even larger NATO presence in the Nordic region. As a result, Russian naval operations in the Baltic Sea might become riskier. Putin is concerned about what this could mean for important strategic military assets stationed on the Kola Peninsula, which sits along the northern border of Finland. It's here that Russia's Northern Fleet is stationed, along with ballistic submarines that are part of Russia's second strike nuclear capabilities. With increased NATO forces in the region, everything from Russian naval ships to aircraft operating in the area will be under closer surveillance, and could be more easily dealt with if a conflict ever did arise. Putin also knows that as his conventional forces continue to be depleted in Ukraine, Russia will have to rely more heavily on nuclear deterrence and its navy to protect its borders and maintain power. There's also the fact that Russia has been planning to use the Northern Sea route to boost economic trade and movement of goods. However, Finland's admittance into NATO now means that more naval ships from other countries, such as the US and Britain, could be stationed in the area and threaten Russian naval dominance in the far north. Hypothetically, having NATO naval bases and an increased regional presence could allow blockades to hit the Russian economy hard.
Yeah,
In
it is
essence,
very
NATO now
difficult
has
now
the
for
ability
Russia.
to cut off St. Petersburg and other northern Russian ports from the rest of the world. Then, of course, Putin is scared about a future military buildup. Finland refused to allow foreign missiles on their soil for a long time. Now NATO can deploy operational tactical missile complexes across Finland, allowing them to strike key targets in Russia more accurately and at a moment's notice. Precision strikes could be launched from Finland to cripple Russian infrastructure and transportation networks, which has Vladimir Putin fuming. On top of that, more NATO aircraft will be stationed closer to Russian borders and could be launched into Russian airspace with incredible speed and devastating capabilities. The bottom line is now that Finland is a part of NATO, the organization poses a much larger immediate threat to Putin's authority. The United States and its allies can police the region more effectively and keep Russia in check. Vladimir Putin hates anything that stifles his power, and Finland successfully joining NATO might be the biggest threat he's ever faced. This
They've
brings us to
taken
the
such a
question,
smart
what
step.
will Vladimir Putin do now?
And planned
He's
it
warned that the
beforehand.
acceptance of Finland into NATO will force him to take retaliatory measures. It's unclear what this means, and if Russian forces are capable of doing anything
I think
besides
it was
losing
just
the
a
war in
scare
Ukraine.
by him, like,
Putin has claimed that
Don't
NATO
do that, I'll do
deploying
this.
troops to Finland would only destabilize the region and threaten the stability of the world in a plea to try to gather support against NATO forces being stationed closer to Russian borders. But this has been wholly unsuccessful and likely would have worked better if Russia had never invaded its neighbor, but hindsight is always 2020. Putin and the rest of the Russian leaders claim that Finland joining NATO was done to spread anti-Russian sentiment to more countries. However, NATO didn't really need any help doing that after the way Putin's been conducting himself over the past several years. The proclamations by the Kremlin to mobilize more troops and deploy more weapons along the Finnish-Russian border are a little more than empty threats, as Russia just doesn't have the military assets to spare at the moment. So instead, Putin's been using harsh words and posturing to try to seem strong during a time when he's becoming weaker and weaker. Because if we're honest, losing power is what Vladimir Putin is most afraid of.
Right.
And unfortunately for the Russian dictator, the bad news keeps on coming. On the same day that Finland was admitted into NATO, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was invited to join NATO's July summit in Lithuania. On top of that, European leaders arrived in Beijing to speak with President Xi Jinping about the war in Ukraine and trade relations. If these talks result in China either dialing back its support for Russia or lessening its economic and military aid, it could be the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin. Even though China has continued to support Russia, it needs to maintain positive relations with Europe, as the EU is one of the biggest trade partners and much more important to the Chinese economy than Russia is.
Yeah.
Therefore, these meetings might result in a powerful blow to
You
one of
need
Russia's
European
only
money, you need
remaining
to, like,
lifelines.
give away
Vladimir
support
Putin
to
is in
Russia.
a rough spot. Finland joining NATO is just another consequence of his war in Ukraine, and will likely result in an even weaker Russia in the future. And perhaps the biggest slap in the face for Putin was summed up by Secretary of State Antony Blinken when he said, "This is the one thing we can thank Mr. Putin for,"
Even they
referring
are
to
putting
Finland
salt on his
joining
wounds.
NATO. Because he's right, Vladimir Putin was so sure he had the most powerful military in the world. He was sure his forces would easily overtake Ukraine and that his rule would be welcomed with open arms. He was sure that no one would stand up to him, and now he can't be sure of anything. When Finnish President Sauli Niinistö spoke during the induction ceremony, he stated, "The era of non-alignment in our history has come to an end. A new era begins." This new era will likely result in a weakened Russia and Vladimir Putin struggling to maintain his power.
So now we know that why like Putin is scared of Finland's new NATO membership, and like we already saw that like how Finland is very very strong with its military, and like how they can put in so much money into their military. But now we also see like being a part of NATO is something else. Now you are so powerful, like Russia cannot even dare to touch them. And the thing is, it is because of Russia's actions only. And like we see in Ukraine, what is happening in Ukraine is just the main thing is like everybody thought that when Russia will attack Ukraine, Ukraine is gone. There is no way Ukraine can defend it. But the way Ukraine is defending, because of that, all the other countries are like, who the fuck are you? How can you touch us? Like you cannot do anything, because like everybody thought that Russia is one of the most powerful military in this world, this and that. But when it came about war, and they could do nothing, and they are just standing there. I think so it is also because like Russia did not calculate like, okay, the world will support Ukraine. Because now what is happening is like nobody is supporting Ukraine directly, but money is still coming in. Like people are donating money to Ukraine, and not people, like countries are donating money, and then US is like continuously supporting Ukraine with its own weapons. So like now now Ukraine is getting so many weapons for so much less money. So due to that, that is the big problem for Russia, and they cannot fight USA ever, and that is the big problem. I think so. Like Putin needs to understand. Like Putin now has only two options. Like either he gets his own like sanity and he says that okay, I lost the war, so I'm sorry, I'm stepping down. But that is not how Putin is. The other thing he can do is he can go for a nuclear strike. Like if I'm going out, I'll go out with a bang. If he does that, then that bang would be very very scary for the whole world.
I think the one thing I learned from this whole episode is that you need to have good friends in your life. They'll be there for you when you know things go wrong. So that is what Finland is doing. It's you know by joining NATO, it made sure that now he has so much power, so many friends, powerful friends, that they'll help it whenever in need, and that is what is scaring Russia away. So I think that is very important. This is actually what we can learn from this whole thing that is going on.
Yes, and the thing is like Finland is becoming friends with NATO, and the thing is like all of these countries will now help Finland in any shape or form. And the thing was, it was neutral all this time, but then it decided, no, I don't want to be neutral anymore. I want to be against Russia. So what do you guys think about it? Do let us know in the comment section below. So do like, share and
Subscribe.
bye.